Hello AP World History students. Welcome. This is lesson 7.7 and we are finally to the topic of World War II. And for many of us that love history, the cluster of stories that make up World War II is oftentimes right at the center of that. My own learning journey with regard to loving history began here in many ways. For me, it's that it shows us our best and our worst. So yeah, our target today, I can explain the causes of World War II. We always know this. It's much more important to know the entry points into a conflict like this and the exit points out of it. It's more important to know that than it is to know, how General Patton used his, armored division to blah, blah, blah. That's not really what the point of our class is. So let's begin. Unlike World War I, the causes of World War II are in some ways kind of easy to explain. If my 8-year-old daughter asks me, why did World War I happen? It's a complicated answer, right? And it's like, well, sit down for a little bit and let me see if I can explain this to you. If she asks me why did World War II happen, it's somewhat simpler to explain. It's like there's a couple countries and they were being really, really naughty, right? And let's name these countries. These countries are the Axis powers. There are Japan and Italy and Germany, all right? And so I want to talk about the destabilization of the world in the 1930s and the role that these three Axis nations played in this, and the role, the bad role that the rest of the world played in watching it happen. It's an interesting question. A more complicated question than why did the war happen is when did the war start? We typically say 1939 when the Nazis invaded Poland, but as we'll see today, in many ways the war is already ramping up and well underway at that point. If you want to, you could make an argument that the war started back in the early 1930s with all of Japan's reckless aggression. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, which is a semi-autonomous part of northern China. And then several years later begins a full-on invasion of China. Now Japan's invasions here all have to do with resources. Japan is an industrialized nation, but the Japanese islands are relatively resource poor. And I'd say old cultural grudges between the Chinese and Japanese played itself out in horrific ways. The treatment of the Chinese by the Japanese is something nightmarish, and I don't want to go too in detail on that. You'll do a little bit more with it in your World War II scrapbook project. The world is watching it again through the lens of we have our own Great Depression going on, but the world is watching this just like, whoa, Japan, hey, what's the deal here? And the League of Nations is kind of like, and Japan's like, well then fine, we're leaving the League of Nations anyway. And they're going to kind of propagandize all this as Asia for the Asians, right? Why let China be picked over by the Western powers? This should be an Asian power. This should be a playground area for an Asian power like us to move in. And this aggressive road is underway. In Europe, some of the same story is being repeated. Now, not with the same violence initially. Of course, it will go there eventually. But what's happening in Europe is that Italy and Germany are also expanding. Right? Now, Italy, Japan, and Germany have this sort of agreement, right? And the agreement is, look, we each have our spheres. Italy, you can sort of expand into Northern Africa, right? Germany is going to expand into sort of Central and maybe someday Western Europe. And Japan, East Asia is your sphere of influence. And we will sort of give each other the mutual thumbs up on this. So, this is happening in sort of fits and starts. It's not like 1 year all this began, but it's sort of little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit, and the rest of the world is sort of not responding enough until it's just too late. In 1935, Mussolini orders Italian troops into Ethiopia to expand their colonial holdings and avenge that loss that we wrote about in that DBQ not so long ago. This is a bloody invasion, and the rest of the world looks on with, again, sort of startled shock and harsh words, but not much more than that. Germany, in Germany, Hitler's using this ominous word of Lebensraum, right? It's like living room, right? We need living space, elbow room, all All right. Germany is a great industrialized nation with a dense population, and we need autonomy. And what that meant is like we need access to sufficient farmland and resources where our people can support ourselves. And that's, right now the Treaty of Versailles left us sort of pinched and cramped, and we need to expand this. All right. And there are German-speaking peoples in Czechoslovakia, German-speaking peoples in Poland, German-speaking peoples in the Rhineland region between France and Germany, German-speaking peoples in Austria, of course. Hitler himself is Austrian, right? And so he's talking about the need to kind of unify and unite all these peoples. And so Hitler begins in 1938 the formal expansion process. Now this has been sort of threatened and talked about, and everyone's not sure if he's for real on this. And in 38 we have the so-called Anschluss, which is like the German takeover of Austria. Now this is done peacefully, right? It's sort of strong-armed, like, come here, Austria, old buddy, old pal, like, we're going to put our arm around you, and all right, now you're part of the German Reich, right? Germany, Nazi Germany, sort of takes control of Austria, and Austria goes along with this because they sense we don't have a better option. By the way, you might have seen all this in the movie The Sound of Music, if you've ever watched that film. And next he moves into the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, where many German-speaking peoples live, and so it's sort of like bit by bit, Hitler is expanding. So Germany, the Nazi government sort of takes over Austria and turns Austria into kind of part of the German Empire, or like a puppet state for Germany. And then Czechoslovakia, where you see where Prague is, and Bohemia, Moravia, that was all part of Czechoslovakia. And at first he's just taking over the hash-marked areas, but then soon enough they'll take over that whole government. Then he's moving his soldiers and mobilizing into the Rhineland region, the kind of the border region between Germany and France, and taking occupation of that. And of course, even the idea that they had a military violated the Versailles Treaty. But this is Hitler's whole strategy. His whole approach in this period is basically saying, well, what are they going to do about it, right? What if we do build up our military? Right? And we say we're got to do it for economic reasons, or like the treaty is unjust, and all those reasons he offers. But Hitler's basic calculation is, what are they going to do about it? I mean, they're all dealing with their depression, right? This Great Depression. They're all like, they're all in difficult situations. What are they going to do about it? And Hitler is sort of calculating they're not going to do that much about it. In response to all this expansion, Britain and France, from a position of fear and weakness, adopt a policy of appeasement. And appeasement basically goes like this: all right, let's be cool for a second here, all right? How about this? We will let you do that. We're going to tell you we don't like it. It makes us mad. It's not how good countries ought to behave. Shame on you, shame on you. But we're going to let you keep it if you agree to stop. All right? And this sort of keeps happening. Like he moves into Austria and everyone's like, hey, you shouldn't do that. And Hitler's like, all right, I know. And then he goes into Czechoslovakia and everyone's like, hey, we told you to knock it off. And Hitler's like, well, the German-speaking peoples, and we got to unite them, and blah, 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 blah. And everyone's like, all right. The Rhineland, hey! And he's like, yeah, well, look, we're done now. It's all square. We're all done. And everyone kind of backs off again, right? It's like a naughty kid in class who just sort of calculates, the teacher might yell at me, the teacher might be mad at me, but who cares? I don't like the teacher anyway, all right? I want to respect this teacher anyway. It doesn't bother me if they're mad at me, because they're not really actually going to do anything. They're never going to actually send me to Wass's office. I'm not ever going to really get, detention or suspension. Nothing's really going to happen, right? Some of you can know. You're like Hitler, is what I'm trying to say. All right. Anyway, so why would they do this? Why would the Western powers react so fecklessly, so poorly? Well, some reasons. World War I is right in front of their minds, and they said, yeah, that was bad. All right, that was a disaster. And we're afraid if we sort of step in here and like shove them out of the way, or say, hey, you can't do that to Czechoslovakia, who we don't really care that much about anyway, that we're going to end up in some repeat of World War I, and that was terrible, right? They also said the Great Depression's happening, right? We're eyeball deep in our own problems here. We're just not ready to deal with this. And in World War I, you know, we had the United States there on our side at a certain point that was very useful, and they're kind of looking like, is the U.S. going to join us? And they sense, correctly, no, the U.S., I mean, the U.S. on this one is sort of just whistling a happy tune, or you know, we're just doing our own thing and trying to ignore the fact that there's a big thing brewing over there. We'll talk about that next time, but the U.S. wants nothing to do with this. And on a weird strategic level, France and Great Britain both calculated the real danger to world peace is the Soviet Union. That's the real danger. That's the one we're really afraid of, because that involves a total social and economic revolution. All right? And so maybe, I mean, like the fascists in Germany and the communists in Russia, they hate each other, right? And so, like, ideologically, they're supposed to hate each other. So maybe best case scenario, maybe like they end up going to war and obliterating each other, and we can just sit back and eat some popcorn and go, oh man, it's nice when two bad people take care of each other. Like there's a thought that like maybe they can be there as a buffer. And so there's a big conference, this Munich conference. It's infamous. It's infamous because of how ineffective it was. And you see the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who sat down with Hitler and said, Hitler, you've been very naughty, right? And we don't like what you're doing. Now, you're agreed, correct, that you're not going to do this anymore. And Hitler's like, totally, I'm not going to do this. Hitler's a great actor, right? He could sense who his audience wanted him to be, and he could be that. And he could be the sensible, agreeable fellow who wants to get along. And he's like, guys, I took care of my business. Now we've got the resources we need. Germany is set. You don't need to worry about me. I mean, Russia, we all hate Russia, right? Like we're agreed on that. And everyone's like, yeah, and they all laugh about how dumb the Soviet Union is. And Chamberlain's like, well, good. All right, so we got a piece of paper. And he comes back, he's like, I got Hitler to sign the piece of paper that says he ain't gonna do it anymore. Problem solved, everybody. And Hitler's internal calculation is, they're so afraid of conflict and they're so afraid of war, they're not gonna do a darn thing. And then, whatever it is, 9-10 months later, he makes a move. The move happens in 9-10 months where suddenly the Nazi Germany invades Poland to the east. That's bad enough, all right? Because then everyone's like, oh my gosh. And they can point out and say, Hitler didn't abide by the terms of the Munich conference. And that means that we do have to step up here, all right? This will mean war over Poland. Maybe we wouldn't normally care about Poland, but this is sort of like, we have to step up at some point. That's fearsome and terrifying enough, but even more terrifying than that is when reports come in. It's not just that Germany has invaded Poland from the west, it's that the Soviet Union has invaded Poland from the east, and this is happening in a coordinated fashion. And wait a minute, what has happened here? Have these two forces like joined up with each other? The West recognizes we are flat-footed, ill-prepared to respond in war, right? We just aren't ready. We've been hoping, like kind of, this ostrich approach of like hoping it would go away, all right? Hitler, meanwhile, it's like they've already had spring training and they're ready to rock and roll, right? He's got like a ramped up, mobilized army in fighting shape that's already like steamrolled through Poland. The Soviet Union is coming from the east, and what that means is like they must be coordinating with each other, and that was true. What we find out later is that Hitler and Stalin have signed not an alliance, but what was called a non-aggression pact, all right, where they just said, I won't fight you if you don't fight me, all right? Let's just leave each other alone. And to celebrate this agreement that we're not going to go to war, let's divvy up Poland between each other, right? And that's like our ceremonial feast, so to speak. Now, Stalin was dumb enough to believe, hey, good, cool, now I've avoided a war with Hitler, and I can go back to, oppressing Ukraine or whatever I want to do. Hitler, as everything, signs this and seems perfectly sincere and has every intention of breaking it when the time is right. For everyone else, it's like, okay, the Soviet Union's not going to take care of our problem, and in fact, our problem is massive, and in fact, this problem is metastasizing into full-blown, like, stage 4 cancer right now, right? We have to move now, and we are not ready for this. World War II has begun, and so we have the Allies, the two primary allies from World War I, Great Britain and France, the Axis powers, as they were called, of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Italy. Neutral nations are the Soviet Union, which has been paid off with Poland, all right, and the United States, which just wants nothing to do with it, all right, and we'll explore that more in the next lesson. And this is horrifying. To watch this war play out is like watching a heavyweight boxer in their prime fighting someone who is not ready and not trained and not ready for this fight. The key to the Nazi success was what's called Blitzkrieg Warfare, which is like using speed, motorized vehicles, right? Air attacks, motorized vehicles, tanks, and the idea is you don't sort of have these slow plodding foot soldier armies. You like lance through places with armored vehicle attacks, and you overwhelm your enemy. And then like that's reinforced with foot soldier support coming through. And it is a discombobulating, disorienting effect. It is extremely successful, especially against places that are, like we said, caught flat-footed. And it's like one country after the next is falling. All right? The Netherlands, Belgium, Nordic nations, they're all like following one after the next. It just in days, all right, the Nazis are sweeping through. Okay, now they're in France. Certainly France is going to put up a fight, and the answer is not nearly enough of a fight. It's just weeks when suddenly France falls, right? The whole war is almost over in that first season of fighting, especially at this place called Dunkirk. You might have seen the movie, where basically the entire Allied army force, which is French and British, is like pinned up against the ocean. A German miscommunication prevents them from they're just there for the taking. All right, a German miscommunication buys these forces here a few extra days to wait it out, and they're saved by a flotilla of some military ships, but a lot of just like private boats from Great Britain coming across the channel to like scoop up as many soldiers as they can and get them back to Great Britain, because otherwise the whole war would have been over, right? And Hitler would have had Western Europe just like it would have been over in less than a year. The Battle of Britain is Hitler forgoes the idea of a invasion, like sort of bringing his ships over and invading the island of Great Britain, and instead tries to bomb Great Britain into submission. You're going to do a bit of research on this for your scrapbook project, but like the Battle of Britain is fought in 1940. It's fought over the air, all right? And Britain, the idea of the Nazis is we're going to bomb them to smithereens. We're going to bomb the British into submission. We're going to target all these civilian sites. We're going to obliterate London. Now, it ends up being a crazy battle over the skies. But I will say, guys, the World War II at this point is basically Great Britain versus the assembled might of the Axis powers, who are undefeated, all right? And Britain, you got to stay alive. And this is where Churchill does his most heroic work, basically forbidding anyone in his government from talking peace terms with the Nazis, saying, we are not going to do it. This famous speech that he read numerous times on the radio, I'll read an excerpt here. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And the British didn't. So here's our war in 1940. All right, the French are done. All right, they're sitting this one out now. There's some French soldiers still out fighting for the Allies, but the French government is out of commission. All right, and it's Great Britain asking for help, and the United States is, again, we're just hanging out watching Gone with the Wind back home. I mean, we're not interested right now. Stalin's got his non-aggression pact with the Nazis, so he's like, I'm fine. Let's watch the world burn. Who cares, right? Like, they're not going to fight me, so he feels safe. In the United States, President Roosevelt is very inclined to get involved. He's like eager, he's an active president, and he wants to do more, but he also is an extremely skillful politician who looks at the lay of the land and says, the American public, by a broad consensus, doesn't want to touch this thing with a 10-foot pole, all right? The general consensus is, do not send our boys off to fight in that war. And so Roosevelt doesn't. Right? I mean, he's following the people's lead, and he's making some incremental moves, right, to help. And Americans sort of feel like, look, I mean, helping, fine. Sending our boys off to war, no. So some of the helping moves, the cash and carry provision, is just a notion that like the United States has military supplies and ships and weapons, and tell you what, Allied powers. You come on over here, right? You pay cash. We're not going to do this like tangled web of loans that sort of contributed to the Great Depression. Also, we're not going to be shipping them overseas because, like, overseas trade is what led the United States to get pulled into World War I. So you come over here, you pay us cash, and you can have as much as you want, right? We will furnish those military goods for the Allies, not for the Axis, all right? That's signed in the late 1930s. By 1940, when it's like Britain standing alone against the world and there's a point of desperation, Roosevelt signs into law the Lend-Lease Act, and this is much more dramatic. And this is basically saying, here's the deal: the Allied powers can take as much of our equipment as they want. They can have as much of our equipment as they would like. We will basically give it to you and say, pay us back later, right? So how about this? And I'll say, when we say pay us back later, what's between the lines is, if you survive, maybe. We'll figure that out later. Frankly, they never did pay us back, right? Because that wasn't really, the point wasn't to get paid back, all right? They didn't pay us back because they were in shambles after the war, and it would have been preposterous for us to ask them to pay us back. The idea of this is the United States is in a stronger economic position. We're coming out of we're coming out of the Great Depression in part because we're mobilizing our army and we're mobilizing our military. And so what we're saying is, the United States is going to pick up the check for this war. Hang tight, Britain, right? We are furnishing the war for you. This is a declaration of economic war. Americans went with this because it was good for us economically. It was putting people back to work. And there was also a sense of, like, if we don't do this, Nazi Germany takes all of Europe. And so this was a move that people were willing to make, but until Americans felt directly under attack, they were still saying to FDR, don't send our boys off to war, and we weren't there quite yet. In 1941, Hitler made what is likely his largest tactical error in the war, and that was invading Russia while he still had enemies on the Western Front, right? While Britain had not been fully dealt with, he invades Russia and opens up an Eastern Front of the war. Now, this is done in part out of impetuousness and impatience. All right. It's also done out of overconfidence, right? I mean, now that in his defense, the Nazis, batting average in these invasions, they're batting 1,000. All right. So his estimation is, Russia showed itself to be an inept fighter in World War I. Right. There's all kinds of good information to tell us that Stalin has killed all of his top officer corps, which was true, and we are a lean, mean fighting machine. And so in June 1941. The Nazis invade the Soviet Union. Stalin is totally flabbergasted. He cannot believe that this has happened. He was foolish enough to trust Hitler on this non-aggression pact. And at first it looks like a redo of the France situation, right? Nazi troops are just barreling east and they're within miles of Moscow. And then some things change, right? The Soviet Union's military response improves. Winter begins setting in. The Nazis are not adequately prepared for the cold, in part because they were overconfident and believed that they would have wrapped this up by then. Right? And so those factors, the Soviets also sort of as they say, they hugged the Nazi lines. They sort of stuck really close to the Nazi lines, and that meant that the Nazis couldn't use their air advantage to just sort of bomb the Soviet positions, because the Soviets are right on top of the Nazis. Now the Soviets are beginning to push the Nazis back west, and this is one of the key turning points in the war, and the fighting is savage and grim. You will do something about this in your scrapbook. But this is a key turning point where now the Nazis are losing ground and the Soviets are gaining the upper hand in the East. So our situation in 1941, we now have two Allied powers, right? The British and the Soviets. And the United States is neutral, but there's a big asterisk there, right? We're neutral, but we're picking up the tab for lots of parts of the war. Students, I hope you have a great weekend. And God bless you guys.